Jayam Vishnupada Paramhamsa Parivirajakacharya Stotra His Divine Grace His Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki Jayam Vishnupada Paramhamsa Parivirajakacharya Stotra Sri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada ki Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda ki Namachar Haridas Thakur ki Prem se ko Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasati Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki Shri Radha Krishna Gop Gopinath Shyamakunda Radha Kindi Gauri Govardhan ki Mathura Vrindavan Dap ki नवदीप मायापुर धाम की जगन्नाथपुरी धाम की गंगा माई यमुना में की भक्ति देवी तुलसी महारानी की समवेत भक्त वृंद की गौर प्रेमानंदे all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to Sri Guru and Gauranga Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we are reading from today from Canto 3, Chapter 31, verse 22 and 23. So 22 does not have a purport, I'll read it by myself, but 23 we will chant together. Kapila Uvacha. Yeah, I'll read it myself. एवं कृतामतिर्गर्भे दशमासयः स्तुवन् ऋषिः सद्यः क्षिपति अवच्छीनं प्रसूत्यै सूति मारुतः. Translation. Lord Kapila continued, the 10-month-old living entity has these desires even while in the womb, but while he thus extols the Lord, the wind that helps parturition propels him forth with his face turned downward so that he may be born. 23. We'll read this together. Tena avasṛṣṭaḥ sahasā kṛtvā avāk śiraḥ āturaḥ viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāsaḥ hata-smṛtiḥ tenāvasṛṣṭaḥ sahasā tenāvasṛṣṭaḥ sahasā kṛtvāvāk āturaḥ viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāso hata-smṛtiḥ tenāvasṛṣṭaḥ sahasā kṛtvāvāk āturaḥ viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāso hata-smṛtiḥ tenāvasṛṣṭaḥ sahasā kṛtvāvāk āturaḥ viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāso hata-smṛtiḥ. viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāso hata-smṛtiḥ kṛtvāvāk śira āturaḥ viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāso hata-smṛtiḥ kṛtvāvāk śira āturaḥ viniṣkrāmati kṛcchreṇa nirucchvāso hata-smṛtiḥ sahasā. avāk tena, by that wind, avasṛṣṭaḥ, pushed downward, sahasā, suddenly, kṛtvā, turn, avāk, downward, śiraḥ, his head, āturaḥ, suffering, viniṣkrāmati, he comes out, kṛcchreṇa, with great trouble, nirucchvāsaḥ, breathless, hata, deprived of, smṛtiḥ, memory. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation: pushed downwards all of a sudden by the wind, the child comes out with great trouble, head downward, breathless and deprived of memory due to severe agony. Purport: the word kṛcchreṇa means with great difficulty. When the child comes out of the abdomen through the narrow passage, due to pressure there, the breathing system completely stops, and due to agony, the child loses his memory. Sometimes the trouble is so severe that the child comes out dead or almost dead. One can imagine what the pangs of birth are like. The child remains for 10 months in that horrible condition within the abdomen, and at the end of 10 months he is forcibly pushed out. In Bhagavad-gītā, the Lord points out that a person who is serious about advancement in spiritual consciousness should always consider the 4 pangs of birth, death, disease and old age. The materialist advances in many ways, but he is unable to stop these 4 principles of suffering inherent in material existence. Thus ends the purport. Om ajñānatimirandasya jñānāñjana-śalākaya chakṣur-unmilitam ena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasati Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. So it is mentioned here in Bhagavad-gītā, the Lord points out that a person who is serious about advancement in spiritual consciousness should always consider the 4 pangs of birth, death, disease and old age. Does anyone remember which chapter this verse is mentioned in Bhagavad-gītā? Yeah, correct. Yeah, basically in chapter 13, Lord Krishna says what are the different items of knowledge. And it's kind of combined of 3 verses together. So the middle verse, verse number 9, it says here, Indriyateshu vairagyam an ahankara evacha janma mrityu jara vyadi dukkha doshanu darshanam. So out of these different items of knowledge, it is mentioned here that the renunciation of objects of sense gratification, indriyateshu vairagyam, renouncing sense gratifying objects, and anahankara means absence of false ego, and janma mrityu jara vyadi dukkha doshanu darshanam means the perception of evil of the evil of birth, death, old age and disease. The word mentioned here is dukkha doshanu darshanam. Darshanam, what does darshanam means? Darshanam means basically to see. Means one should perceive or they should see these 4 pangs of suffering, and those are some of the items of knowledge. But someone can ask a question, isn't that something everybody sees? I mean, it's a suffering, right? If it's a suffering, everybody sees this suffering, right? So let's say someone is deceased, he or she thinks that, they perceive that it as a suffering. They don't perceive it as some kind of an enjoyment, right? They do perceive it as some kind of a suffering. So does it mean that everybody has this item of knowledge present in them? Right? I mean, nobody sees it as a suffering. Everybody suffers, but why don't they see it as a suffering then? Yeah.
They don't understand the significance of it. They're covered by their intelligence is stolen by illusion.
Right.
They don't understand the significance of what this is.
Correct. So even though a person is suffering, but because his intelligence is stolen, so he don't see it. Even though he's suffering, but he don't see it, right? So let's say that, just a small experiment. Let's say that if you go to any, like an emaciated beggar or like some homeless person, right? And if you ask him a question, my dear sir or madam, are you suffering, right? And can I help you in any way to, mitigate your suffering? What would they say? No, you're fine, right? So you can see that they're actually suffering. But when you ask them, are you suffering? You'll get all kind of interesting responses, right? So, I was looking into this, the city of Los Angeles budget and how much money they spent on, dealing with this homelessness, right? Last year they spent $1.28 billion. $1.28 billion just on, treating the homelessness crisis. I mean, some of it goes to housing, some of it goes to like they give some allowance for their food, and some of it goes to like mental health services and all those things. So all those things put together, LA City is spending $1.28 billion just last year, right? And I found an interesting article that some of our book distributors, or we go to Venice Beach, even Radhayatra we conduct on Venice Beach, right? And there is a lot of homeless people over there. And I don't know if you see this lady, but you will see this lady in Venice Beach. She's a homeless person, and a lot of people may not know her, but actually her name is Loni, Loni. So actually she was once upon a time a famous personality. She was actually a model. But now you will see her in Venice Beach as a homeless person. And some people identified her, some people recognized her. Hey, you are that, that famous personality. And they tried to interview her. It became a news that this famous personality is now in the Venice Beach. And you will be shocked to see her previous picture. That was her before she became homeless. Anyway, long story short, basically she married to this person, and then they had some kind of a, domestic, problems, and they ended up in kind of an abusive relationship, and later on she turned into alcoholic, and then later she turned into a drug addict, and now basically she ended up as a homeless person in Venice Beach. And when people saw her in that condition, there's all this media and all this attention, and people were writing articles about her. And then her family came to know about this. Her family and friends came to know that now she's in Venice Beach like a homeless person. And they tried to, talk to her and basically try to help her, by giving him some assistance. Basically, they even tried to kind of pay her all the expenses. You don't need to, stay in that condition. And for all the rehabilitation, her friends and family tried to help her. And interestingly, after she was provided with this nice accommodation, she ran away. She didn't want to stay there. She was fine where she was in Venice Beach. So this is a condition, right? I mean, even though apparently we see that this is kind of a miserable life, and sometimes sane people, they even like to help these kind of a people, but when you help them, actually they don't like that. They are fine with whatever condition they were before, right? So, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, how even these people end up in this condition. Even it's not that they want to, be like that, but what happens is that it's a gradual degradation, because it starts with, alcohol, then it goes to drugs, right? And then, it's basically every step of degradation for them, it becomes a new normal. It's normal for them. It's like a slow degradation. It's like a downward spiral they end up. And when you hit the rock bottom, actually the mind is such a tricky thing that it makes you feel comfortable in whatever situation you are, even though it's most filthiest situation, right? So actually, that is why it is said that dukkha doshanu darshanam, that even though there is suffering, but one has to see this suffering. And a lot of people actually, they don't see this suffering. And they have their own reasons why they don't see this suffering, because if they see this suffering, it's going to make them even more depressed, right? Because there is no other way out. For them, at least, that's what they think. So, that is why it is said that, one has to see this suffering, and that is one of the items of knowledge. And actually, that is one of the energy of Maya, right? There are two propensities of Maya. What is that? Avarnatmika Shakti and Pratyapakshmika Shakti. Avarnatmika Shakti, see, what is Avarna? Avarna basically means to cover. So that is one of the potency of Maya, to cover, the covering potentiality of Maya. See, covering not necessarily is the spiritual covering the spiritual identity. Even the material identity is also covered, right? People forget. And Prabhupada gives the example of the son of a rich man, right? He forgets that his father is so rich, and he kind of, roams around like helpless. So that is one of the potencies of Maya. And the other potencies of Maya is Pratyapakshmika Shakti. Pratyapakshmika means, okay, now it's covered, now this becomes a new normal. Like you kind of like comfort in that situation. First you get covered, and second thing is you become more comfortable in that situation, wherever situation you are, right? So this is how Maya works. That is why it is tough. Even though people are suffering, they don't actually realize that they are suffering. And this suffering, we all know that this suffering is actually of three types. Yeah, Adhyatmika, Adibhautika, and Adidaivika. What is Adhyatmika? Adhyatmika means suffering from one's own mind and body. And Adibhautika. Adibhautika means suffering that is inflicted from other people, like people around you, right? Because when you become a homeless, they try to steal things from you, right? I mean, being homeless is not an easy thing. It's tough. You need to be a tough guy. And that is why actually, that is interesting. She was, when this lady was being interviewed, it's not that the day one itself she was so dirty. She was actually clean when she became homeless also, like apparently. But she mentioned that people were actually stealing stuff from her. They were stealing stuff, her items from her. So, in just to kind of repel people away, so she kind of dressed in a bad way and, kind of being smelly, so that other people don't steal her stuff. So that's just a gradual degradation, what we see. So, yeah, so that is why we have suffering inflicted from people around us. And the other suffering is Adidaivika. Adidaivika means we all know, like from the nature, right? Excessive sun, excessive cold, earthquakes. So in this way, there are different types of sufferings which are being inflicted by ourselves and people around us and the nature itself. But even though we say that there are three types of sufferings, ultimately there is only one suffering. That is adhyatmika suffering. Because see, if you see the example of like a great saintly people, sometimes people put even great saintly people into, inflict suffering, but they're not disturbed, right? So ultimately the suffering is in one's mind, right? I mean, if the mind wants to suffer, it will suffer. If mind doesn't want to suffer, even though there is an external situations, provocative situations, they don't really suffer. Just like the other example of children, right? When they're playing, sometimes they get hurt when they're playing, but they don't realize that, they just keep playing. But after when they're done with the playing, then they will show you that they got hurt, right? Because their mind is so focused on something else that they are not affected by any kind of suffering. So ultimately suffering is in one's mind, and ultimately there is only one type of suffering, which is adhyatmika suffering inflicted by one's own mind. So in this way, and it is mentioned here that one of the consequence of suffering or excessive suffering is loss of memory. That's what is mentioned in the purport, right? It is said here, head downward, breathless and deprived of memory due to severe agony. And Prabhupada mentions here, it says kṛcchreṇa, means with great difficulty. So because of this excessive suffering, one of the consequences of excessive suffering is one loses his memory. Actually that is nothing but avarnatmika shakti, because that's required, right? Because for example, when a doctor is doing an operation, they sedate, right? Because there's excessive suffering, they cannot tolerate that. So sometimes forgetfulness is good, so that a person kind of lives a normal state of mind. So that is what Maya does. Maya also sedates by avarnatmika shakti, by forgetfulness. And and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that this chapter and the previous chapter, which is basically describing these four types of suffering, what is the purpose? What is the reason why Bhagavatam is mentioning all these things? And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that the reason why Bhagavatam is discussing all these things, it's not that devotees are going to do these things. The reason why it is mentioning is that, see, we all know that there are three types of intelligent people, right? There's first class, second class and third class. So the first class intelligent person is someone who studies it, understands it and will not commit that mistake. And second class intelligent person is that who understands by committing the mistake, right? So definitely devotees, they all first class intelligent people, and by reading all these things, that we expect that we do not commit any sinful activity by understanding all the kind of suffering one has to undergo if they commit that kind of suffering. That is the purpose why Bhagavatam is discussing all these things. That is what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, the purpose of chapter number 30 and 31. And as we all know, the consequence of committing sinful activity is punishment. Punishment in this life and punishment after life in hell, right? So now the question is, if somebody asks you a question, what is the purpose of hell? Can anyone tell me what is the purpose of hell? It's a simple question. Yeah. Ultimately reformation. Okay. So hell is basically for the rectification, right? What is the word did you use exactly? Okay, tough classroom. Okay. Tough love. Okay. Right. So is that the purpose of hell? Ultimately. Okay, reform. Reformation is one of the purpose of hell, right? I mean, we hear these things very often. Reformation is purpose of hell. Is there any other reason for hell? So generally it is mentioned that rectification or reformation or purification is the purpose of hell. But if you think about this, reformation as a purpose of hell, see, hell is actually a material place. It's a material place. And the punishment is also a material activity or material action. So if you ask a question like how can a material place and a material action can reform a person? Can it really reform a person? Okay. Right, yes. Correct. Yeah. Yeah, you can respond, that is true. So you can have a different response, right? So by, when you suffer, your response changes, right? Because you're suffering. But the question is that, does that response rectify? Does that response purify? Yeah. Yeah.
It just depends on the degree of where the individual is.
Okay.
In other words, reformation is maybe for a person who comes to prison, they don't commit the most simple activity or whatever.
Correct.
So, but the reformation is very difficult because everybody...
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're surrounded by criminals, right?
Yeah.
How does it reform you? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So generally, see, we must understand that, whenever we say it is rectification, see, rectification, it simply means that, it is, the karma is getting balanced out. That's all. Because now you have accumulated a good karma when you do good activity, it cancels out when you enjoy in heaven. When you perform a bad activity, you get a bad karma, and then it cancels out by undergoing suffering. That's what it means. Basically, it's not really a rectification in the sense of rectification, it just means that it's basically cancelling the karma or just nullifying the karma. So that is what it means basically. Yeah, it's a justice system, but it's not really a purification by itself, because hell is a material place and these are just material activities. So how can a material activity purify a person? It's not actually. So that is why in the 5th canto, 26th chapter, verse number 6, Prabhupada mentions in the purport, by the influence of Maya, however, the conditioned souls remain infatuated with the mode of ignorance. Thus, in spite of repeated punishments by Yamaraj, they do not come to their senses, but continue to live within the material condition, committing sinful activities again and again. That's all it is. Basically, the cycle of birth and death continues. Even though a person goes to hell, that doesn't mean that after hell he's liberated. No, he's going to come back again. And he's going to repeat the same activity once again. Again, he either goes to heaven or hell. So, the hellish planets are not necessarily a rectification as such in that sense, right? Because ultimately, what purifies a person is devotional service. Ultimately, what purifies a person is bhakti, right? So, that is what is mentioned in the nectar of devotion, right? What are the 6 qualities of bhakti? Kleshagni subhada, moksha laguta, krit, sudurlabha, sandrananda, visheshatma, Sri Krishna akarshani sa cha. So what is it here? Klesha Agni. What is Klesha Agni? Means it basically destroys all suffering. And what is Shubhada? Basically it bestows auspiciousness. And Moksha Laguta Krit means it derides the conception of liberation. And Sudurlabha means it is rarely attained. And Sandrananda Visheshatma means it puts one in the transcendental bliss. And Sri Krishna Akarshani, that it can attract even Lord Sri Krishna. So ultimately the purification and rectification only happens through practice of devotional service and through the potency of bhakti. So that is why even though we go through all these sufferings, punishments, this thing, that thing, reformation, ultimately it doesn't purify anybody. It just goes in cycles. A person, even though temporarily rectifies, but he again goes back to his old habits, right? So in this way, ultimately, what is required is that one has to practice devotional service. But there is an advantage of suffering. There is one advantage of suffering. What is that? Exactly. Yeah. So that in a different way, it is mentioned in the Bhagavad-gītā, there are 4 types of people who approach Lord Krishna. Who are they? That Chaturvida Badantyemam, Janana Sukruta Arjuna, Artho Jignasur, Artati, Jnanicha cha Bharatarshaba. Basically, there are 4 types of people who approach Krishna. Who are the 4 types? The distressed, the desirer of wealth, the inquisitive, and one who is searching after the knowledge. So, if a person, after suffering, if some thought comes to his mind that let me mitigate this suffering, by practicing devotional service, if that gives an impetus for him to follow or surrender to Lord Krishna, then there is a chance that he may take up to the path of bhakti. But the suffering itself does not have the the potency to purify. But if that suffering leads a person to surrender to Krishna, then that opens the doors of liberation to such a person. And interestingly, Krishna says here, out of these 4 types of people, who is the best? One who is in knowledge. He says jnanina tavatat jnani. Basically he says out of all these 4 types of people, the best person is someone who is a jnani, or who is in knowledge, or who is seeking the knowledge. Because ultimately to seek something one has to be inquisitive, and inquisitiveness is one of the most important qualities. And that is why if you see any good devotee who has a good standing in Krishna consciousness, and if you ask him, how did you become Krishna conscious? They all have the same answer. They always say that they had a lot of questions, they were asking a lot of questions, they were reading Prabhupada books, right? Basically that's a sign of inquisitiveness. And that is why even Krishna says the best among the 4 is someone who is inquisitive. And inquisitiveness is such a good quality, that is why the education or acquiring knowledge is actually a lifelong process. It doesn't end at a certain point. That's a lifelong thing, and it goes, that's a quality a devotee has throughout its life, to be inquisitive and to be gaining more and more knowledge, right? So that is how a person, even though after undergoing so much of suffering, if that suffering leads or gives him some impetus to inquire into what is the higher truth of life, and if he is fortunate enough and to come across a devotee, and if he gets a chance to purify himself, that is where the real rectification or purification begins. So anyway, that's my class. I like to end my class here. Any comments or questions? Yeah.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you for a wonderful class. Interesting, because you see that we were talking about reformation and pain and suffering, but what I'm thinking is when you're making that comment was that, if a person is sleeping, the only thing that can wake them up is the ears, the hearing. They have to hear. But we see in society, that's not what happens. They want to see. They want to learn through seeing. Oh, I saw this, and they want to. In other words, we're seeing that the baby's coming out of the womb, and we see and we think, oh, this is beautiful. It's just what a wonderful situation. Whereas you can't understand the suffering of that living entity unless you experience it. And we see in the material world, they don't want to hear about suffering.
Yeah.
If you start talking about suffering, people really want to they want to move away from it.
Yeah,
if someone's really ill, they feel very uncomfortable, they don't want to hear. So same thing, in order to get out of this material world, if we want to get out of this world by seeing, you're never going to get out.
Yeah.
The only way you're going to get out of this suffering is by hearing.
Yeah.
So we see that in Krishna consciousness, why it's so specific, that we hear, and we hear from a bona fide source.
Yes.
And from that hearing, it's the only thing that can save us.
Correct.
Nothing else but hearing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because seeing means seeing with knowledge, right? Because that's what seeing means. It's not just like seeing without knowledge, because that's what like a doctor, right? When a doctor sees, but doctor has knowledge, so he can diagnose what's your disease. But everybody else seeing, but he's not really seeing it because he doesn't have the knowledge of what's the root cause of the disease, right? And then ultimately, if you look at the root cause of suffering, it's basically avidya, ignorance. And ignorance basically means absence of knowledge, right? It's not necessarily absence of knowledge, it also could mean improper knowledge, right? Because everybody has knowledge, it's not that nobody has knowledge. It's basically, it also means improper knowledge. That's also it could mean. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, we know simply suffering doesn't
make us Krishna conscious, then you have to surrender to Krishna. Even if you're in whatever type of yogi you are, if you don't take up bhakti yoga, then you can't get liberation, actual liberation. But doesn't suffering bring you to the point of surrender? No matter what, whether you surrender through knowledge or in need of money or suffering, my understanding is that the suffering that you go lifetime after lifetime, universe after universe, at a certain point that will you just come to the conclusion, even subconsciously, that I had enough of this.
Yeah, you want to answer? Yeah, sure.
It's an educational instrument.
Yeah.
It's just like a teacher. A teacher has different ways of teaching. One might be punishment, but if a student doesn't want to learn, some people are stubborn. Living entity always has free will. It's obviously, there's living entities that are in this material world since time immemorial, and you don't have to respond to suffering. It is an educational instrument, and the fortunate soul will respond to that in the right way, as Ravindranath sort of described that. I've had enough of this. And then Krishna and who's in the heart can understand that this living entity is saying he's had enough. Let me give him a chance. Let me put him in contact with a spiritual master. Let me put him in contact with some Krishna conscious literature. Let me put some prasadam in his mouth or whatever,
Yeah.
But you don't have to. You could still continue to be stubborn and despite your suffering, continue on.
Yeah, because ultimately the modes of nature are always acting. You see, even though we come to a realization that I'm done with this suffering, but the modes of nature are still acting. After the time passes, again he becomes hopeful, that again he may continue his propensity to enjoy, and it goes on forever like that, right? Because as long as a person is under these three modes of nature, there is no question of liberation.
Purification. I just heard this Prabhupada in a lecture that Prabhupada said purification comes from Krishna. It's not that we can do things. Yeah, we could do things to attempt to become purified, but ultimately purification comes from Krishna. So Krishna is in the heart, and he's responding. He's watching what's going on, and he's responding. Just like I gave a class a few weeks ago, and I said, lamentation can be good. And you pointed out in the class, lamentation is good, but I didn't make it clear enough that it has to lead to devotional service.
Yeah.
You see, then that's when the benefit kicks in.
It's like a stepping stone, basically, right? Basically, it's a stepping stone. That is why, even though sometimes you say that mode of goodness is more congenial for practicing spiritual life, right? Because the mode of goodness that is more helpful, that's required to acquire knowledge, and through knowledge, right? That's how we do devotional service. So sometimes, interestingly, even suffering, even though suffering is not really a mode of goodness, right? But still, if it is, acting as an instrument, that's, why not, right? What's the problem with that? Just comment something.
I think it's already said it, but in the 13th chapter, the process of knowledge, that is described there, that one may be aware of each one of those items of knowledge.
Right.
But also mentions that the most important of all of those is when one comes to unalloyed devotional service.
Yeah.
So if you are not ready to take the medicine, like you go to the doctor and he gives you all the diagnosis and everything, here is the medicine.
Correct.
Then what is the use? So that's the same thing. You can be knowledgeable of each one of those items, but if you don't take devotional service, what is the use, practically speaking?
Like going to a doctor, this is a good example or good analogy, right? So going to a doctor, right? Going to a doctor is step one, and taking the medicine is step two, right? Going to a doctor doesn't cure you. Only taking the medicine will cure you. But going to the doctor is a stepping stone for your purification, right? It is something like that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Does any questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Bhagavad-gītā the Lord.